Hey guys, it's Mrs. Rast here, and you'll be taking notes today over the Lewis and Clark expedition of the Louisiana Purchase. You'll be using your notebooks, write everything that's in red, and please be aware of the guiding question that you see on the screen here as you go through. Okay? So I want you to think about if you woke up one morning and discovered your house had grown twice as big. How would you feel? What would you do? Well, in 1803, Americans faced a very similar situation, but on a much larger scale. Jefferson had purchased 820,000 square miles from France, known as the Louisiana Purchase, and suddenly doubled the size of the U.S. Americans were excited about this, but it was also a mystery. What did the land look like? How would you cross it? What kinds of animals and plants lived there? Would the natives who lived there be welcoming? Very few had traveled to this western part of the country, and the few maps that existed were pretty patchy and unreliable. So Jefferson decided to hire a group of men to explore this new America. Jefferson's first choice to lead the expedition was his trusted secretary, Meriwether Lewis, who asked his friend William Clark to share command. Both had been officers in the Army and had experience traveling through wild country, but had not attempted a journey like this one before. Jefferson's goals included first asking Lewis and Clark to explore and map the unexplored territory, especially the Missouri River. Jefferson dreamed for a long time there might be a river that ran from the Missouri all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which would make travel much easier. So that's the Northwest Passage right there. Second, Jefferson asked Lewis and Clark to observe, record, and collect specimens of the local plant and animal life. The president wanted to know what natural resources existed for future American pioneers to live on. And lastly, Jefferson asked Lewis and Clark to seek out the native tribes, study languages and customs, and make friends with them if possible. Jefferson wanted the Native Americans to think of him as their new father, though ironically, Lewis and Clark would be more like children, dependent on the help and kindness of the Native Americans. Ultimately, the expedition would require Lewis and Clark to act as explorers, mapmakers, scientists, and diplomats. It was a lot of responsibility, but they were excited to try. So, today you can fly across the U.S. in about 6 hours, but in 1803, Lewis and Clark had to make the journey without planes, cars, motorized boats, or even roads. They spent about 6 months recruiting men, buying supplies and equipment, and learning as much to prepare as possible. It was hard to prepare because Lewis and Clark had no idea what they would find or how long they would be gone. So, on May 14, 1804, the journey begins in St. Charles, Missouri. This was a group of about 45 men. Only one ended up dying during the expedition. The Corps, made up of Clark, joined Lewis in St. Charles and headed upstream on the Missouri River in the keel boats and 2 smaller boats of a rate of about 15 miles a day. Heat, insects, and strong river currents made the trip challenging at best. To maintain discipline, Lewis and Clark ruled the Corps with an iron hand and doled out harsh punishment, such as bareback lashing and hard labor for any of those who got out of line. On August 20th, 22-year-old Corps member Sergeant Charles Floyd died of an abdominal infection, possibly from appendicitis. He was the only member to die during their journey. Now, most of the land Lewis and Clark surveyed was already occupied by Native Americans. In fact, the Corps encountered around 50 Native American tribes, including the Shoshone, the Mandan, the Mentari, the Blackfeet, the Chinook, and the Sioux. Lewis and Clark developed a first contact protocol for meeting new tribes. They bartered goods and presented the tribe's leaders with a Jefferson Indian Peace Medal, a coin engraved with the image of Thomas Jefferson on one side and an image of 2 hands clasped beneath a tomahawk and a peace pipe with the inscription Peace and Friendship on the other. They also told the Indians that the Americans owned their land and offered military protection in exchange for peace. Some Indians had met white men before and were friendly and open to trade. Others were wary of Lewis and Clark, and some were openly hostile, though seldom violent. In August, Lewis and Clark held peaceful Indian councils with Odo near present-day Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the Sioux at present-day Yankton, South Dakota. In late September, however, they encountered the Teton Sioux, who weren't as accommodating, and tried to stop the Corps' boats and demanded a toll payment. But they were no match for the military might of the Corps and soon moved on. In early November, the Corps came across villages of friendly Mandan and Mentari Indians near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, and decided to set up camp downriver for the winter along the banks of the Missouri River. Within about 4 weeks, they built a triangular-shaped fort called Fort Mandan, which was surrounded by 16-foot pickets and contained quarters and storage rooms, and you can see that right up here. The Corps spent the next 5 months at the fort hunting, foraging, and making canoes, ropes, leather clothing, and moccasins while Clark prepared new maps. According to Clark's journal, the men were in good health overall. While at Fort Mandan, Lewis and Clark met French-Canadian trapper and hired him as an interpreter. They allowed his pregnant Shoshone Indian wife, Sacagawea, to join him on the expedition. Sacagawea became an invaluable and respected asset for Lewis and Clark. On April 7, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent some of their crew and their keelboat loaded with zoological and botanical samplings, maps, reports, and letters back to St. Louis, while they and the rest of the Corps headed for the Pacific. They crossed through Montana and made their way to the Continental Divide, where with Sacagawea's help, they purchased horses from the Shoshone. The group next headed out and crossed the Bitterroot mountain range using the harrowing Lolo Trail and the help of many horses and a handful of Shoshone guides. This leg of the journey proved to be the most difficult, as many of them suffered from frostbite, hunger, dehydration, bad weather, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion. Still, not a single soul was lost. After 11 days on the trail, the Corps stumbled upon a tribe of friendly Nez Perce Indians along Idaho's Clearwater River. The Indians took in the weary travelers, fed them, and helped them regain their health. As the Corps recovered, they built dugout canoes, left their horses with the Nez Perce, and braved the Clearwater Rapids to Snake River and then to the Columbia River. They reportedly ate dog meat along the way instead of wild game. March 1806. In 1805, they did reach the stormy Pacific Ocean. They had completed their mission and had a place to live before returning home. They decided to make camp near present-day Astoria, Oregon, and started building a fort on December 10th and moved in by Christmas. It was not an easy winter. Everyone struggled to keep themselves and their supplies dry and fought an ongoing battle with tormenting fleas and other insects. Almost everyone was weak and sick with stomach problems, hunger, or flu-like symptoms. On March 23, 1806, the Corps left the fort for home. They retrieved their horses from the Nez Perce and waited until June for the snow to melt to cross the mountains. Again, after traversing the rugged Bitterroot mountain range, Lewis and Clark split up. Lewis's group took a shortcut north to the Great Falls of the Missouri River, while Clark's group, including Sacagawea, went south along the Yellowstone River. The groups planned to meet where the Yellowstone and Missouri met in North Dakota. On July 25th, Clark carved his name and the date on a large rock formation near Yellowstone River. He named it Pompey's Pillar after Sacagawea's son. The site is now a national monument. 2 days later, at Marias River near present-day Montana, Lewis and his group encountered 8 Blackfeet warriors and were forced to kill 2 of them when they tried to steal weapons and horses. The location of the clash became known as Two Medicine Fight Site. It was the only violent episode of the expedition, although soon after the Blackfeet fight, Lewis was accidentally shot in his buttocks during a hunting trip. The injury was painful, but not fatal. On August 12th, Lewis and Clark, their crews reunited, dropped off Sacagawea and her family at the Mandan villages, headed down the Missouri River, and arrived in St. Louis on September 23rd, where they received a hero's welcome. Lewis and Clark returned to Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1806 and shared their experience with President Jefferson. Not only had they completed their mission of surveying the Louisiana Territory from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean, though they did fail to identify the Northwest Passage, they did so against tremendous odds with just one death and little violence. The Corps had traveled more than 8,000 miles, produced invaluable maps and geographical information, identified at least 120 animal specimens and 200 botanical samples, and initiated peaceful relationships with dozens of Native American tribes. Both Lewis and Clark received double pay and 1,600 acres of land for their efforts. Lewis was made governor of the Louisiana Territory, and Clark was appointed brigadier general of militia for the Louisiana Territory and a federal Indian agent. Clark remained well respected and lived a successful life. Lewis, however, was not an effective governor and drank too much. He never married or had children and died in 1809 of 2 gunshot wounds, possibly self-inflicted. A few years later, Sacagawea died and Clark became her children's guardian. Despite Lewis's tragic end, his expedition with Clark remains one of America's most famous. The duo and their men, with the aid of Sacagawea and other Native Americans, helped strengthen America's claim to the West and inspired countless other explorers and Western pioneers. And that's it, guys. So once you're done, please make sure you've recorded everything in red, and you should be good to go.